Was Cam Rising and Jaquindon Jackson snubbed from the preseason Pac-12 All-Conference team? We're talking about that and more on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. We are available on all platforms, including YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. This is your first time listening to our show. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. We'd love to interact with you guys in the comments, and we appreciate all of you who helped us reach over 1,200 subscribers. Your support for our show means the world to us here at Locked On Utes. My name is JT Wistersill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. If this is your first time listening to our show, you guys are in for a treat because we are talking all things preseason Pac-12 All-Conference teams, and in order to help us do that, it's ESPN 700's Porter Larson. And Porter, we could start with the guys that made it, but I think there are a couple omissions that I think will catch people's eyes first before the people that did make it. So when you talk about snubs, I think the first name that a lot of Utah fans will look at and feel is snubbed is Cam Rising. He didn't make the first, the second team, or the honorable mention team. And honestly, if Cam had played in any other college football conference, pretty much, I think I would feel that he was really snubbed as well. But because of the talent that's at the quarterback position in the Pac-12 conference, I don't feel like he was snubbed. Number one, when you're talking about the first team, you're talking about Caleb Williams. And Caleb Williams is just a tremendous talent at the quarterback position, the numbers he puts up and everything. As the reigning Heisman winner, I think he deserves that first team preseason spot. Michael Penix actually led the nation in passing yards last year. So I think he deserves the second spot then as well. And then, yeah, if you want to have an argument for Cam being over Bo Nix, I can definitely hear it out. But I don't have a problem with Bo Nix being there. I mean, pretty much every quarterback list you can find will have Bo Nix above Cam as well. I think Bo has shown a little bit more accuracy. I think that's fair to have him there overall. But personally, I don't feel like Cam was snubbed for not being on this team. It feels weird to say that about a quarterback who's led his team to back-to-back Pac-12 championships. But when you're dealing with three guys that I consider top 5 college football quarterbacks, I don't feel like it was a bad or anything, a slight against Cam to not make this list.
Yeah, I mean, you'd like to see your name on there, right? If you're Cam Rising after the couple of years you've had as the starting quarterback. But you mentioned it, JT. I don't really see it as a snub either, simply because of the talent in the quarterback position in the Pac-12 conference. It's, we can talk about the media deal. We can talk about the state of the Pac-12 if you want to. But if you want to zoom in and just talk quarterbacks, it's the best in the country right now. You mentioned the Heisman winner, the nation's leader in passing, and a bunch of talent coming in as well up at Oregon State, up at Colorado. This is a conference that's loaded in the quarterback room. There's only 2 or 3 teams that I think have kind of question marks. UCLA replacing DTR, but they're doing it with a 5-star heralded recruit, right? So it's a loaded quarterback field. And of course, JT, this is a preseason all-conference vote. This isn't what have you done the last 2 years. This is a preseason vote. And frankly, a lot of folks outside of Salt Lake City don't know the status of Cam Rising, right? The last time they saw him in action, he was being carted off the field at the Rose Bowl. So when that's the last memory you have of somebody, maybe you don't ink them in as your all-conference first teamer, especially when there's a Heisman guy there. That being said, Cam's just as good as anyone in the conference as a starting quarterback, especially when you factor in his fit with the scheme that he plays in. And whatever, it's just another chip on his shoulder. Cam doesn't need those accolades. It's going to be November, December, January when the awards that he's concerned about are coming out.
You're absolutely right. And especially when you talk about the voting, because I do think when you're talking about, because as I mentioned, I could definitely see an argument for Cam being over a Bo Nix and even a couple just of the other Pac-12 quarterbacks in general. I feel like Cam belongs firmly at the 4th spot when you're talking about Pac-12 quarterbacks, but right there kind of with the Bo Nix kind of conversation there. But like when it's close between those two guys, that's where the injury factor could play into it when you're trying to project what it's going to look like in the fall. And as you mentioned, for the people outside of Utah who aren't able to tune into an ESPN 700 and hear from Cam Rising say, I'm going to be ready for the Florida game, there's going to be those questions that persist about his health. And I feel like that's why they're a little more down on him. So once again, I can see why Cam didn't make one of the 3 teams here. But one guy that, look, you can make an argument that he doesn't belong on one of the 3 teams, but you should at least be able to vote for him. And according to Josh Furlong, who did have a vote on this, Jaquindon Jackson, was not even an option to select for the Pac-12 preseason all-conference teams, which I think is just insane. I understand that there are the Bucky Irvings of the world and these other established options and everything. And I also understand overall that when you're talking about just the Pac-12 conference in general, that there's a lot of talented running backs, but Utah, what they have accomplished as a team rushing the football in the last couple of years has just been exceptional. And for them not to even have a guy on here that you can vote for, I just think that's crazy, especially Porter, when you look at it this way. When Jaquindon Jackson if Jaquindon Jackson got 10 or more carries in a game, it happened 5 times this past season, he averaged 88.6 yards per game. If you project that over a 12-game sample size for the regular season, he would have 1,044 yards, which would rank him 3rd overall in the Pac-12 behind Charbonnet, who's now departed for the NFL, and then Bucky Irving, who is back. But there's also one caveat to that when you're talking about projecting his success for this season. Last year was his first season playing running back, and he made the change during the season. He has spent all offseason training for the position. We saw how explosive he still looked in the spring game. And also, that was only factoring in rushing yards, as I mentioned, because I do think he's going to play a bigger role in the passing game this coming season as well. So I would be shocked if the season ended and he wasn't on one of these teams, I will say, because I think he's going to have an exceptional year. And I think he is one of the breakout candidates in the Pac-12, because despite how highly he finished the season, it still seems like he's being slept on. And give me all the Jaquindon stock, because I think him not even being a candidate to vote for on this list, I think that's just going to be a bad look when we look back on it, Porter.
Yeah, I mean, you look at what Jaquindon can do in the backfield, right? It's an evolution of him as a player. And the transition from quarterback to running back it's unique. You don't usually see that, right? You see maybe a safety who puts on 15, 20 pounds and comes back and plays in the box as a linebacker. You see a lot of quarterbacks rather go to other skill positions or even receivers. The running back is usually a position where that's a kid who's been carrying the football since he was 8 years old, right? Mm-hmm. So to see Jaquindon make those strides in year one, not even just year one, but JT, like the first couple of times we saw him carry the football, right? The first few games we saw him carrying the football, there were immediately things that you pointed out on film. They were like, oh, this kid can be good. This kid has a future carrying the ball as a running back, not just a quarterback. And, you know, I think the fact that he's not on even the ballot for the preseason is kind of an omission, but at the same time, you got to look at the conference and see there's a lot of returning talent. There's guys back here. You mentioned Bucky Irving, who got first team, who probably should be there just based on what he's done. But again, this should be a projection. This isn't what have you done for us this year. This isn't, or last year rather. This is what are you going to do in 2023? And if you ask me what Jaquindon Jackson put on tape and now, you know, being kind of that number one guy, I think he's in for 1,000+ yard season. I really do. The only reason that he wouldn't be is because he's at Utah and there's a bunch of running backs in this room, right? How much does Jalen Glover kind of surface? How much does Mekhi Bernard get the ball out of the backfield versus as a receiver? Those are all things that might get in the way of Jaquindon Jackson getting 1,000 yards. You mentioned his average. What did he have? 6.8 yards per carry last year?
Sounds
almost
right,
7 yards per carry on 78 attempts. If you can replicate that and you can give us that on a larger sample size, first team, second team, whatever it is, you're going to be on the postseason all Pac-12 watch list for sure. And we talked about it being at Utah. It can kind of be complicated for a running back in that regard because, yeah, you may get a bunch of opportunities, but you may also have 2-3 guys right behind you who are capable backs that Andy Ludwig's trying to get the ball to. So I think it's complicated trying to project forward for a Utah running back specifically because of those reasons. But if you're asking me to look at 2023 and give you the best running backs in the Pac-12 conference, Jaquindon Jackson's absolutely one of them.
He's got to be, especially for the reason you mentioned. I had forgotten, I got caught up in like projecting the yardage. I had forgotten he averaged 6.8 yards per carry. Like that is just absolutely nuts numbers. Like you just don't see running backs do
And
that.
on 78 attempts too, right?
Yeah.
When you're almost 80 attempts and you're still getting that sort of number, that shows an explosiveness, a feel for the game. We're seeing him become a more patient runner, start to understand it's different than scrambling, right? You have to read your blockers differently. You have to find those holes and hit those holes with a different pace than you were when you were quarterback. And Jaquinon's really taken on to that. And that's only going to grow in year 2 and year 3. I think he's in for, you can call it a breakout year because I think people outside of Utah are going to really start to hear his name, but we already know what Jaquinon can do and the type of weapon he can be.
We absolutely do. And I made this point talking with Josh Furlong about just the Pac-12 preseason voting and just how it can change by the end of the season. Let's look back on 2021. Tavion Thomas wouldn't have been anywhere on these lists, probably wouldn't have even been on the ballot. Fast forward to 2022, he was the favorite for all of it. And we know doesn't end up there as well. So this stuff is always flexible to change. And it's going to be interesting to see what kind of year Jaquindon and Cam Rising have. But Utah still came up really good on the preseason All Pac-12 teams. They were well represented on the first and second team. And we're going to talk about those players that were named to those teams in a moment. But first, I want to talk to you guys about our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run. All on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on the MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/locked on. That's all caps, no spaces, locked on to get up to $200 in bonus bets. Once again, that's FanDuel.com/locked on. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Porter, Utah was still represented well on the All Pac-12 preseason teams. In fact, first, let's look over at for the first team and just see which Utes were named there. You got Brant Keithy at tight end, Satao Laumea at offensive lineman, Keaton Bills at offensive lineman, Junior Tafuna, Karene Reed, Cole Bishop, all the guys, a lot of names we expected to see there, right? I love that Brant's making it back there, that people aren't overlooking him despite him coming off that injury a little bit. I think one guy I'm really excited to see on there just for what he's accomplished is Keaton Bills, and not just because he's shown he can do, what was it, a double front flip with the gymnastics team, Porter?
I think it was a double. He was spinning. I don't know what he was doing, but he was spinning.
Yeah, Keaton's is just
moving like that.
Yeah, he's just a tremendous, and Junior was doing a great job over there too. To your just to mention him as well, but yeah, I think that I'm happy to see Keaton get that recognition because it's so often interior offensive linemen do get overlooked. You talk about the tackles, and with Braden Daniels gone, and I am happy to see Satao Laumea getting that recognition at the right tackle spot. But Keaton in particular has been such a mainstay along this offensive line and just hasn't been as mentioned as frequently as much as those other guys have. So I do think it's good that he's getting the recognition here as well. But what name for you stands out that made first team preseason Pac-12 All-Conference?
Yeah, you mentioned Laumea, Keaton Bills. Those two you couldn't leave off. After the last 6-7 games of the year last year, with how they teamed up, of course, with the other starters and Braden Daniels, it was one of the better offensive line units over the course of the last few months of the season in the country. So those are guys that you project forward really, really solid up front. Brant Keithy coming off the injury, right? I think folks looked at the year that Dalton Kincaid had. They look at, of course, where Brant was before the injury and then the time that he got to recover, right? It's not like Cam, who got injured late in the year and, it's iffy on where he is in his recovery. Brant's full go. He's good to go once we're kicking it off here in a little over a month or so. And for that reason, he can't leave him off either. And then on the defensive side, Junior Tafuna, Karene Reed, Cole Bishop, all guys that I really do think will come to fruition, right? They're the solid players. We don't worry about the defense. The one thing I will say, you can call it a snub or maybe just a product of too many guys there. There's going to be another defensive back on that postseason list at the cornerback position, whether it's Zemiah Vaughn, whether it's one of the new guys in there, and Miles Battle, or even Sione Vaki coming up from the safety to play the nickel. Cole Bishop has the that spot locked down. Nate Ritchie coming back from his mission. I don't know who the hell it's going to be, JT, but there will be another defensive back on that all-conference team come end of year.
Well, and even jumping ahead, I actually had listed a couple of like other snubs just for these lists, and Sione Vaki was on there for me. And now he's not an egregious one because once that's another guy, even another kind of layer below what Jaquindon Jackson accomplished. Just like if you watch the games, you can just see what a special football player Sione Vaki showed signs of being. And I think just in a full opportunity to play that free safety role. But you do mention the Nate Ritchie thing, how he's going to factor in everything as well. I would be surprised if Sione Vaki wasn't on there. And even though he was named an honorable mention, to your point about like a Zamiah Vaughn or a JT Broughton, I'd be shocked if one of them is not on the first or second team for the campaign they put together. But yeah, as we mentioned, those are the guys on the first team. As for the second team guys, Van Fillinger, Lander Barton, and the other honorable mentions were Michael Mokafisi and Jonah Ellis. I think those are all really good candidates there, all guys who deserve to get that recognition, deserve to be on those lists overall. And especially when you're talking about a guy and Lander Barton, I think he's a guy I've said by the time this season ends, I think we'll be considering him the best player on this Utah defense. So honestly, if I had to predict, I do think Lander will actually end up on the first team. I actually think he's going to have that incredible of a season. I think preseason, like especially for people outside of Utah, I think second team is a great place and spot for him to be in. But I just think Lander's just going to have an exceptional season. But what stood out to you most looking at the second team and then the honorable mentions as well?
Yeah, well, you mentioned Lander. That's a kid who every time I see him, he's bigger.
Yeah.
And every time I hear about him, he's doing something new in 11-on-11 drills, right? He's making more and more improvements. Since he was 15, 16 years old, he's been training with NFL linebackers, right? A kid who he's on, frankly, a expedited path to what his brother was doing here at Utah, right? Mm-hmm. He's where Cody was when Cody was a junior going into a senior, right? It took some time for Cody to develop and kind of mature into that kind of player, both on and off the field. He had some more things going on that Lander's not dealing with. It's just football for that kid. And man, every time, like I said, every time I see him, it's more and more impressive. I'm with you. I think he'll be a first team guy. I think he's going to be one of the best linebackers, not only in the Pac-12, but if you go another season or two, one of the best linebackers in college football. He is that good. I think he's going to be an NFL player. But again, still room for improvement. That's the crazy part. We saw how good he was later on in the season. JT, I'm really excited to see what he can do in that role. Now that there's a kind of a gap in time when you're a linebacker when I like to, it's not always perfect analogy, but I like to say you're playing on your heels versus your toes, right? Yeah. Linebackers are always, it's a reactionary position being a defensive player. It's always going to be reactionary. You're trying to read the offense and what they're doing at the snap. But there's also a point in time where your confidence in the scheme, your confidence in your film work and your studying of the other team gets to a point where you're not on your heels as much. You're not reactionary as much. You're playing forward. You're playing with a confidence that allows you to get into the backfield quicker. It allows you to fill holes quicker. And yeah, you still read and react and you get back and you do backpedal and get on your heels when the other team's passing. But there's a point in time where a linebacker flips that switch. And I saw that with 4 or 5 games left with Lander last year. And man, once you get a full season under your belt with that kind of experience, things take off from there. You can watch linebackers of past. You saw it happen with Chase. You saw it happen with Cody. Francis Bernard, about half a season into where he felt comfortable in this defense, rather. It's night and day when you see that happen. I've seen it with Lander, and now I'm really excited to get a full season of what I think to be a Pac-12 ready linebacker who's still young and still has room to grow and get better and better. And that's not where it ends at the linebacker spot. Levani Damuni in from Stanford, an all-conference player last season. He's really good. I think a lot of Utah fans, because he was at Stanford, only have seen him play a time or two, right? I don't know how many people are really tuning in to Stanford football lately. He's a weapon for this defense this year. Excited to see how that tandem works. And of course, you mentioned Kareni Reed made the all-conference team as well. there's almost too many guys on this defense for Morgan and co to play with. And I'm really excited to see how they divvy up the snaps, to see how many guys they can throw in the box. And I think we've talked about it a time or two, JT. This is a team that I think on the defensive side has an opportunity to return to the elite status that we've seen. You go back to 2019, certain years where not a top 20 defense. We're accustomed to that. We expect that. I'm talking top 5, top 10, back to where they were. There's a few X factors in there, one of them on the edge in the defensive end position that I think, if someone really surfaces as a Bradley Anai type threat, a Mika Tafua off the edge. We look at Van Fillinger, we look at Connor O'Toole and Jonah Ellis as potential players to make that step. But I really do think that they can be an elite unit if they get back to that. And it starts in the middle, as you mentioned, Lander Barton, Levani Damuni, Karenni Reed, and it just builds out from there. I really do think they have the personnel to get back to that.
There are so many guys on this Utah football team, to your point. I could make a case for them showing up on one of these teams. Another guy we haven't even mentioned is the Samote Pepa. I mean, with the way he closed the season, he'll have a great opportunity to do it. Yeah, 100%. Is there going to be there? Like I said, there are so many guys we could go in. And look, it's obviously hard to get 2 tight ends on this list, but what if Thomas Yasmin really explodes and has more of those big plays we're accustomed to and kind of putting those together? He could be on here as well. So many guys. It's good to see a lot of them get that recognition. And it's always fun to look back on these lists at the end of the season, because as we touched on too, they can change so much over the course of the season based on who breaks out and all those different types of things in general. So it's going to be fun to see how it plays out. And it's just another reminder too, with the release of these preseason teams, that we're that much closer to the start of the season, which is something that's really exciting. But Porter, was there any other name that you think we should mention in this race?
Man, I mean, you mentioned Vamahi and Samote Pepa. I'm curious to see which of those guys, right, gets the numbers to get on the all Pac-12 team. That's really hard to project, because it is a stat that it's hard to follow, right? Interior defensive linemen. You go back in years past, and Utah's had guys like Leki Fotu, John Pennicini, right? Guys who've played several years in the NFL now, who you go back and look at the stat book, they don't really show up for Utah, right? Because they have a different job than some defensive tackles are given in football, right? They're filling they're stopping the offensive lineman in their spot. They're reading and reacting. They're a lot of times just plugging holes and letting the linebackers clean up behind them. So it's really hard to project what kind of player wins awards in the interior line. I look at the player voted trophies at the end of the year in the Pac-12, right? Those are my favorites, because it's actually the guys in there in the trenches. Those are the guys who know the best players in the conference. These preseason awards, it's so hard to project. But, yeah, I mean, Aliki Vamahi, Samote Pepa, Junior Tafuna, the 3-man unit that even goes beyond that, that's going to be rotating up front for Utah. That's going to be such a weapon to be able to have a legitimate, middle presence, no matter who you throw out there, and to have multiple guys that can fill that role. It's such a weapon for Morgan Scalley, because you always have fresh legs in there. You always have a player who can, put pressure on the opposing quarterback, but most importantly, just keep a solid middle ground for your defense, for all of that speed and all of those tacklers behind you to go and as I said earlier, play on your toes, play up front and be aggressive. And that's what I'm excited for. I don't really know which one of those guys is going to get the numbers to get a nod for all Pac-12 or whatnot. I think it's more of a collective that is going to be one of the better interior defensive lines in the conference, and probably the best interior defensive line in the conference.
I definitely feel that way. And I'll say this as well. To me, I would love to see Aliki Vaimahi on one of these teams. To me, he will be the captain of like the underrated team. Like
Right.
every coach and everything is going to know how valuable he is, how many plays he just kind of ruined, took on 2 guys, freed up Corene Reed to come in and make a tackle. But I just think the media, like you said, that's a part that goes under the radar sometimes. And unless you are a Junior Tafuna, who is a freshman, won Pac-12 Defensive Freshman of the Year, and you get put in that spotlight a little bit more, it's hard to kind of reemerge in that spotlight and just get an opportunity to get your talent shown on the interiors. But I definitely agree with you. I think Pepa, Vaimahi, Tafuna, and Tafuna obviously was recognized on the first team, but just those other guys deserve to be on here. And I think they're going to have a good chance to be on here because there are so many special football players for this Utah team in general. And it's going to be fun to see what they can do this coming season. And speaking of this coming season, Pac-12 Media Day obviously wrapped up last week. Although at the time of this recording, we're actually a little bit before Pac-12 Media Day. We were recording this just to react to those all-conference preseason teams that got named. So Porter, I thought we could take a second and try to predict the future here a little bit and say what we think the main stories are going to be for Utah football coming out of the Pac-12 Media Day overall. And for Pac-12 Media Day, look, the number one thing everyone's going to be talking about is the media rights deal. We already know they're not going to get a media rights deal done, barring something just absolutely insane. It's not going to get done by the time this also comes out next week. This sounds like something that's going to drag on into August overall. But I think the national media, one of the big things that's going to pick up from this is I do think that Cam and Coach Witt are both going to continue to say what they've said on your guys' shows, the ESPN 700. I just think that they're going to continue to hammer home like, hey, we expect to be ready, or I'm going to be ready for the Florida game. And I think because those guys will say that, that will be kind of just echo more throughout the national landscapes. I think that will be a big one overall. I also think I'm curious to see what like Coach Witt will say in general. I'm trying to figure out if I think there's anything really. I'm interested to hear what you're going to have to say. I'll come back to Coach Witt when Witt circles back around to me. But for you, what do you think kind of like the biggest stories coming out of Pac-12 Media Day for Utah are going to be?
Well, you mentioned Cam, right? That's what everyone's going to ask about. That's what everyone's going to ask Kyle about and Cam. And you're not going to hear anything different. And frankly, even if Cam's not ready for week 1, you're not going to hear anything different, right?
Yeah.
They're going to continue to say that he's on track and he's ready to go because that's strategically the best thing to do and make Florida prepare for that. Ultimately, I think it's true. I've been around Cam a little bit this summer. I've been around him in off-season settings where he's working through injury, and he's a guy who focuses on what he has to do to get ready. I have no doubts about that as long as there's no hang. Story involve Utah at Pac-12 Media Day are I don't know that there's much to talk about. These are the two-time defending champs.
Turners, you're right.
They're the two-time defending champs. We kind of know everything about them, and I think there's a reason that it's just Bill going down to Media Day. I'm not driving down to Vegas to talk to Kyle and Cam. They're right here, right? I don't really think there's much for Utah. It's business as usual. They're going to go down there, get their pictures taken, smile for the camera, and then it's back to Salt Lake to get ready for camp and get ready for business. The only curiosity for me for Pac-12 Media Day is if we can get any insight on the future of the conference, where we're headed. And the reason that there is actually a Utah tie there is because of Mark, who, number one, is going to be with George Kliavkoff as they're talking about the future of the conference, the state of the Pac-12. George has tabbed Mark as kind of a lead guy on this. And I think that is notable that he's using Utah's athletic director and the defending Pac-12 champions as kind of a flagship as far as the administration side goes. And we can go back. I know this pod is being released later, but just yesterday, the Stanford president resigned, which if you know how the executive committee rotates, the next school up would be Utah to join that executive committee on the Pac-12 ranks. So does Taylor Randall step into that role? I'm really curious to see. And once this pod is released, I know we'll maybe have some answers here. But that's the big question to me is, where is this conference? If we get a media deal or not, okay. But how are these people speaking about the media deal that by all accounts they're going to be presented with today? We're recording this on Thursday, or tomorrow, Friday at Pac-12 Media Day. We may not learn about it, but the presidents and chancellors are, if rumors are correct, being presented kind of the finalities of this deal. And how they speak about it publicly is going to be really interesting to me, and where Utah specifically is placed and positioned as far as leadership goes in administrative roles in the Pac-12, I think is really interesting because it seems like George Kliavkoff is really at least including Taylor Randall, Mark Harlan in a lot of these decision-making processes. And I think that's interesting if you're here in Salt Lake.
It is really interesting. It's going to be very curious to see what is all said there. As we mentioned, I think the last thing I'll throw in, I think Kyle Whittingham is going to make a comment about how excited he is to bring, just to tie this full circle, Liavani Damuni into the program, having gotten him in the offseason program and everything. And just, he's going to say something like, expect big things from him. Like, he's going to be a dude. And I think a lot of Utah fans are going to be a lot more excited about him after we hear those comments in general. But it's going to be interesting to see, as well as you mentioned with President Randall, how that all plays out. But Porter, if people do want more all things Utah football talk, where should they head over to give it a listen?
Yeah, of course, daily on the station. Bill from 11 to 2, and then Spence and I go from 2 to 6 every day. We're kind of flipping gears to football right now, right? We got a month and a half left. Still some soccer stuff going on, but we can turn the page from the Jazz now. It's now, summer league's over, draft is over, free agency's over. So the next 43 days leading up to kickoff, we're going to be talking a lot of Utah football, a lot of college football. So ESPN 700, ESPN700sports.com. And then come kickoff day of the Florida game, it'll be Nate Orchard, who is replacing Isaac as my co-host this year, live from probably Rice-Eccles Stadium. We may have a remote somewhere as well. But, it'll be Nate and I 4 hours before kickoff every Utah game day. Excited for another season of covering Utah football. And, yeah, JT, I think it's going to be another good one as we hope to cover maybe a three-peat.
That would be a lot of fun to cover. I think I speak for just a lot of fun to watch as I speak for all the fans as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all goes. And Porter, really, really appreciate you for joining us. Make sure you guys give him a follow at Lars_ESPN. But Porter, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks, JT.
That's going to do it for today's edition of Locked On Utes, but we'll be back with you tomorrow talking more things Utah football.